on Book TV.
Cynthia Crane is the author of Divided Lives, The Untold Stories of Jewish Christian Women in Nazi Germany. Next, she discusses the experiences of 10 women who were partially Jewish and the persecution and discrimination they suffered in Nazi Germany. It's about 50 minutes.
Good evening. I'm Sharon Kelly Roth, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Books & Company to tonight's author event. With the onset of the Third Reich in Germany in January 1933, Jews were no longer defined under religious or cultural terms, but as a race. Hitler saw to it that Jews were separated from what he considered normal society, or pure Germans. A person who was married to a Jew or who had a Jewish parent or grandparent was no longer considered a pure German, but rather a Mischlinge, a half-breed. It made no difference that the person was a practicing Christian, because if his or her ancestry showed a Jewish connection, then Hitler considered them Jewish and therefore subject to the Nuremberg laws and persecution in many guises. Our author this evening has researched what life was like for the Mischlinge in Nazi Germany. And the result is this book, Divided Lives, The Untold Stories of Jewish Christian Women in Nazi Germany. She brings a passion to her work, since her father was a Mischlinge, as a child of Jewish Christian parents in Nazi Germany. Through his first-hand accounts and interviews with other Mischlinge, with her grandmother, she brings their story to us. Dr. Cynthia Crane is Assistant Professor of English at Raymond Walters College at the University of Cincinnati. Among her awards are a J. William Fulbright Scholarship and a PEO National Scholars Award. Please extend a warm Books & Company welcome to Dr. Cynthia Crane.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. I think that you said it all in the introduction, explained it very well. Divided Lives is a book about the Mischlinge, as Sharon said, who were considered half-breeds by Hitler. They were from Jewish Christian, they were the daughters or sons of Jewish Christian mixed marriages. And as she correctly said, my father was a Mischlinge, and he escaped in 1939. My grandfather got out in 1938. My grandfather was considered Jewish because he had a Jewish name, or was considered to have a Jewish name, of Cohn. And he was not a practicing Jew, and our family has been traced back to the 1700s, but there was still no sign of anyone attending a synagogue, so the split had come a long time ago. But because he carried that name, he was persecuted under the laws, and consequently my father and his family would have been. My grandmother, however, was Aryan and Austrian, so, you know, the blonde and blue-eyed, so she was considered Aryan, and was able to maneuver through Germany more easily, which also enabled her to help the children to get out to follow my grandfather. And it's because of a lot of wonderful people in the United States that my father is here today, and he would perhaps talk about this a little bit later. I want to open this talk with the first chapter, actually the second chapter, the law, which will give you some idea of what it was like to be in this situation in Germany. And perhaps you can just sit here for a minute and ponder what it would be like if you were in this position. And I'll just read this. Today you wake up and you are told you are not who you thought you were. You are young and have been happily leading a carefree life, heading into a promising future. You sit down in the living room and your mother or father reveals one secret in your family that will change your life from this day forward forever. The government has changed cleverly and insidiously from a democracy into a dictatorship, one built on hatred and fear. and you are the scapegoat. You no longer have the right kind of blood, the right name, the right family background, the right physical features to be considered a member of your society, city, or state. Blue eyes and blonde hair are favored, and you have neither. According to new laws, you had better be Aryan, but by definition, you no longer are. You have always been an insider, but you are now an outsider. You have never been a victim, but now you are victimized. You can no longer attend school, see your familiar friends, have a profession, or marry anyone of your choosing. Nothing and no one is to be trusted. The world you've been living in has metamorphosed into an incomprehensible labyrinth. Can't talk. What goes through your mind? Why is this happening to me? Is this true? I want to die. By degrees, your family is torn apart in ways that are irreparable and irreversible. Like having a love, a passion, the likes of which you will never again see, once you have passed through it, your identity is altered. As with a broken heart, some healed, and some did not. You cannot explain to others how your soul and heart have been defiled. The nails have left invisible marks that only God can see, although you try to show the marks when someone you trust asks. But there is always a sense that another breach of faith or of confidence will follow, that someone will pick up the hammer again and hit the nails. This is not make-believe, but happened in this century to people in this book. When we hear someone talk about a divided life today, it usually refers to a division between work and family, or work and social life, or children and spouse. It does not readily conjure up images of the Third Reich and the Holocaust, of people who were torn between a German and a Jewish identity. Through the 10 stories of women's voices here, we receive a clear picture of Mischlinge and what they endured under Hitler's laws. In the Lübeck Memorial Chapel, iron bells had fallen in 1942 during the Allied bombings, and they lay there still, badly broken and melted on the smashed floor. It is astonishing to see. Later, these bells haunted me and became a symbol of the Mischling women, a witness, a survivor, something left behind but no longer in its original form, and the fall itself had altered the piece forever. And that's the beginning. So with the onset of the Third Reich in January 1933, Jews were no longer defined under religious or cultural terms, but as a race. So then in 1935, the Nuremberg laws were passed where Jews were no longer considered German in all of the categories. If you can imagine, everybody was categorized according to the purity of their blood. Okay, and because my father is here, and I would like for him to come up and talk a little bit about his part of the story before I continue on with a couple other pieces from the other chapters. And I think he can say it better than I even wrote it. Thanks. I'm really putting him on the spot here, but you agree to it.
It's not always a situation I like to be in, except I'm terribly proud of this girl for writing this book, and I can't deny that. But it's and also it's been a long time since I was a 10-year-old, and one of the things that isn't nice to remember, or you try to put it behind you, but she brought it all back into the thought processes today. It's a strange situation in 1938 when really the greatest part happened after Crystal Night, what they call now Crystal Night, which was the destruction of all the Jewish businesses in Hamburg. And all of a sudden, being beat around the head by your school teacher, who was a friend of the family, to make sure that the other kids go home and say, hey, I'm still a real good Nazi. And some of the bullies in the class and took up with it too, so Mother finally had to pull me out of school. The one thing that I'm grateful for, two things, is that the tremendous help that we got from the Quakers in the United States in bringing my older sister and myself out. The two younger ones were taken care of. We came out of Germany under the American quota system. And if I remember correctly, in 1939, they were allowed 8,000 Germans were allowed to immigrate to the United States. And in order to do it, you had to have an affidavit. You had to have someone vouch in the United States and present a voucher of some sort that designated you had so many funds set aside that you would never be on the welfare roll or a cost to the United States government. So we were already sitting on the bus, and I think it was in front of the American consulate in Hamburg, ready to be trucked or bused to the SS Washington to board and come to the United States. There was, again, a last-minute glitch on the part of the United States where something had to be reconfirmed that there was money set aside for me. And the Quakers came up in the last minute in order to come up with $35 a month, mind you, in 1939, and that was a lot of money, to make sure that I wouldn't be somewhere on the welfare roll. I've always been grateful for that. And one of the other things that I've always been grateful for is that through my whole life, I've made sure that nobody does anything like that to anybody within my sight or know-how. I'm sorry.
It's emotional, hard for that. Thanks.
It's and that's the part I don't like. As you get older, you know, these things well up in you again as you start remembering again. And I have never had any love for Germans since, and I really never enjoyed going back.
On that note, thanks. I think that this is typical of the stories of the Michelin. It's also a very emotional topic, as you can see. When I went to Germany, I went in 1994 on a Fulbright scholarship to interview people. I actually didn't go to interview in the beginning, but I went to research people who had survived from mixed marriages. I was very interested in this topic because I hadn't actually grown up with these stories. As my father said, it slowly came about that he started talking about it, and also my grandmother. So I would spend 4 or 5 hours over at my grandmother's listening to her stories, and I became really fascinated by this whole issue. I thought, well, what happened to the people who stayed behind? How could people who are in this situation live there when essentially they were living with their persecutors they were there for 12 years, and now they were living with the people who had persecuted them. So I started to get very fascinated by this whole idea of how could people still live there. And when I went to Germany, I just researched in the archives, and I found a lot of material about my own family, but I couldn't find anything about mixed marriages in the archives. And of course, women, especially at that time, weren't in the public sector, so there were very few documents about women who were in this situation. So I decided that it would be best to try to find people who were still alive and talk to them. And this was a very long process because there were not people running down the street saying, gee, I would love for you to talk to me. I was persecuted under Hitler's Third Reich, and I'm a half-breed, and it didn't happen. So with connections with city officials and getting announcements placed in newspapers, I started to get feedback. And I hit in a big newspaper in this column that was sort of a gossip column, and they had articles, little short articles about people who might have seen a bus accident last week and who was there. And then it had mine listed, announcement of if you were in this situation, that time, please contact me. Well, then I got a flood of letters. It was in a weekend column. However, they didn't write me with open arms. Come on over to my house and let's talk. It took a long time even after that. At times they'd introduce themselves and tell me what happened, but they'd sort of leave it or might leave a phone number. One woman told me she would call my phone number and let it ring 3 times and hang up and call me back. Then I would know it was that she was calling me. So there was still a lot of fear. On the one hand, people wanted to talk. On the other hand, they were afraid and they wanted to trust me. And I think the most important thing I did was I built trust finally between myself and these people so that they could talk to me. And I think because my family was driven out of Germany, that they felt close to me and that they could talk to me. Otherwise, I don't know that this book would have happened. And again, these are the often forgotten victims of the Holocaust. Very little has been written about these people. It's perhaps a chapter or so in a history book, but not full-blown narratives about these people who were actually caught. They're straddling the fence, as they say in German. And indeed, even today, they're still caught in some senses. They're not really certain of their identity. And I was really fascinated by that aspect, too, because I think the book isn't just about Germany and the Third Reich or the Holocaust, but it's also about all of us and how do we form our identity? How do we find out who we are? As I've had a variety of people interested in the book from different races, ethnicities, backgrounds, and gender. It's not just been a woman's book because it's written, it's women's voices here, but a lot of men have also read the book and been very touched by it. And also, it's not just depressing. There's a lot of uplifting pieces in these stories because they're survivors. They went through things that we can't even imagine. As some of my students say, this is like fiction. Did this really happen? Because for them, it's 60 years ago, and I always have to bring it up to the current times and make it contemporary. There are unfortunately, a lot of contemporary issues that are similar, unfortunately. But it just is so unbelievable for them to understand. But I think through this book, it's helped them quite a bit to picture what it was like at this time. So again, I think that if you're also interested in identity splits and the psychology behind this, I think it's also an interesting book, even if you're not interested in this period of time. I'd like to talk just a little bit about some of the stories, and I know you can ask me some questions about it later as well. I'd like to just read a section from Ingrid Vecker's story. Ingrid Vecker is an artist, and ironically, her father was killed by the Nazis. He was considered crazy, and her mother was Jewish and survived. So this was a real twist in this story. They had asked him to divorce his wife, which of course was also, there was a lot of pressure on the Jewish spouse to divorce the Aryan spouse. And he refused, and he was released from, he was a policeman, and he was not allowed to be a policeman anymore. And he slowly got more upset about this, and he wasn't really mentally ill, but was considered so by the Nazis. So again, they ended up putting him they put him away, and then they killed him and sent the ashes home to their family and had them pay for the postage for the urn. So this is, you can imagine what this woman experienced. And here her mother was Jewish. Well, they decided that they would try to prove that they were Aryan, or at least become part Jewish, so that they could survive. And I just wanted to read a section of that to you because it's so absurd that you have to go prove that you're pure. And, it ended up that a lot of the people, if they looked, and I say in quotation marks, they looked Aryan, then they could pass. Okay, and some of you might be familiar with that idea of passing just in the United States. And here's Ingrid's voice, and they are all in first person. Even though I give an introduction, I let their voices speak because I want it to remain authentic. In 1942, my mother won a crazy court case. I have it in German here, von Witziger process, a lawsuit that was simply crazy, with the result that my mother was considered half Jewish. My grandma died in November 1940. She was buried in the Jewish cemetery in Hamburg. After my grandmother died, my mother was rather unprotected. When a Mischling lost the Aryan parent, he was considered Jewish and could be deported. In her last days, my grandma had the idea that my mother should claim she was the illegitimate child of an Aryan Christian father. In reality, her father was Jewish. After my grandpa died early, my grandmother had to rent rooms. One of the renters was a sailor, Captain Fuchs, who became friends with the family. With the help of witnesses, such as neighbors and friends who gave false oaths, my mother could convince the judge that she was the daughter of Captain Fuchs, although in reality she was about 7 years old when Fuchs first rented a room. My mother and I then had to go to Kiel, where our bodies and skulls were examined for Aryan features. And because we looked Aryan, the judge decided that we were half and quarter Mischlinge, respectively. A remark he made, however, during the process revealed that he did this knowing we were not. My brother and I were then quarter Jewish because of our Aryan father. That's why the family was not transported to the concentration camp Theresienstadt, where many Jewish people died. In March 1945, a superior judge from Leipzig questioned this decision. So already they were suspicious. To win time, my mother's lawyer, a half-Jew himself, said that all the paperwork was destroyed during the Hamburg bombing raids and it would take time to get new papers. 2 months later, everything, the Third Reich, was over. So essentially, her life was saved more or less through this process, which I think is one of the interesting aspects, the absurdities of, you know, having your head measured. And if any of you have seen Europa, there's a scene in there of where they're actually, you know, going through that process of proving whether Solly in that movie is Aryan. Another little piece that's another important aspect of these stories are the experiences at school. Is my father said he was beaten by his teacher every day to prove what a good Nazi was, and my father didn't know what Jew meant because he was raised Christian, although he eventually did understand what that meant. And when you're 10 years old, as I have in the book here, and he talks about, he just wanted to wear the Hitler Youth uniform like everybody else. I know that sounds terrible, but it's true when you're a kid. You want to belong, and, you know, he didn't understand. So here's another piece from Vecker when she's trying to explain what happened to her in school. And this is one situation that a lot of the children experienced. They usually had a teacher that was very pro-Nazi, so they had a lot of trouble in school. So she says, I remember one teacher, Fräulein Schulze. She was a little heavy handicraft teacher who had long hairs that she brought together in a knot on top of her head, and she wore a big hat. All the students wanted to play a trick on her. I usually didn't participate in student tricks because I was aware of the consequences for my mother and me. The students manipulated the teacher's hat, put it back on the desk, and stuffed it with a couple of potatoes. They asked me, because I could draw very well, to draw a cartoon on the blackboard of this teacher putting on her hat while all the potatoes fell out. So I did it. National Socialism obsessed another teacher, 180% Nazi, which means more than normal. He wanted me to come into his office after that incident. First, he just was swearing. Later, he slapped me once in the face and asked me, "You must have put the potatoes in the hat too, right?" "No," I said. Then he answered, "This is one example where you can tell the lying of your Jewish people." I wanted to apologize for this drawing and give him my hand. He refused it and said, "I don't shake the hand of a Judenschwein," which is a Jewish pig. This teacher excluded me from physical education as a punishment, so I had to sit in class alone when the other students were playing sports. So this is an example of what often happened. And later, she actually gives us another story when she was married to a man who was an alcoholic, but he called her over the phone once and called her a Judenschwein, and that was it. She divorced him. But you can see the connection, and I'm not, as the writer, I'm not interrupting her narrative, but as you read it, you understand that that meant that was it for her because of that memory when she was young. Of course, there were other things. It wasn't a direct cause and effect, but that was the straw that broke the camel's back for her. And Ingrid is probably one of the most whole people. I mean, you can see that some are still more fractured than others, and some have put their lives back together. I'll also briefly just mention Ruth Wilmschen's story. So you can see in the book all these chapters are divided by their names, and also just a little saying that I pulled out, quotation from one of their narratives. Her mother was actually transported to Theresienstadt, and she describes how first she was in a work camp, and for some reason this always stands out for me, that she said, "My mother always had deep red stripes down her bare back because the SS soldiers had fun mocking the prisoners by throwing the hot iron hanger with clean clothes onto the backs of the nude women. From this transport, my mother gathered 27 Jewish stars and money because, as she said, there will come a time when nobody will believe what happened. So let's keep this as evidence. I thought that was also very telling. I just want to kind of finish up with the reading. I don't want to just keep reading sections, but I think that I'll end with Ursula Bosselman. Her story is incredible, and she's the final story in the book. And she was an illegal dancer during the Third Reich and later became a theologian. She was in a dance school where the woman allowed her to keep dancing even though she knew that she was half Jewish. And one time a little girl in the dance school found out that Ursula was, and she said, well, I'm going to go, I'm going to tell everybody. And so this Lola Roga, who ran the school, went home. She said, fine, go ahead, even though she went home and spent the whole night awake, worried to death, because the children were the ones often who would tell, and they'd be in prison. The person would be in prison, the Gestapo would come, and that would be it. So children could be very dangerous. The little girl came back the next day and was crying and said she was sorry. So here Lola Roga had spent her whole night up, worried that she would be thrown in prison and probably killed the next day, but the little girl let it go. So she took a real chance having Ursula in her dance school, which was really important. It really kept her spirits, high, and kept her going during that time. But she became a theologian, and she said she thinks she became a theologian to forgive, even though she found it hard to forget. And she lost her Jewish grandmother, was killed. Actually, she killed herself before she was deported. And she lost her sister. So all the people close to her were killed. And she is still here and going very strong. And she ends with, I am sometimes asked if I can forget and forgive. I think forgetting is impossible, but I can accept the way my life's turned out, and it definitely was a very rich life. Forgiving, I would say, is not permitted to us, the survivors, because we, quote, came out of it, unquote. I would like to ask my grandmother and uncle, we would all have to ask the millions of those murdered for an answer to that, but they are silent. And that was the end of the book. So I would like to open it up to questions if anyone has questions. And I think I can take this off here, right? I don't know. I think this is a lot easier. Okay.
The first one is, you said, unfortunately, we have some contemporary issues that are similar. Would you tell us what you meant by that? And also, could you direct some comments to Jewishness as race and where that stands today? I spent some years in Europe, and I heard that frequently. Would you share your views on that?
Okay, everyone heard the question? Okay. The first part was the contemporary issues. Well, I think there's been quite a number of them, right? The ethnic wars that still are going on. I mean, we had a situation in Bosnia. I still think that in the United States, I think that there's also a kind of crumbling of morality, and if anyone knows the history of Germany, the Weimar Republic, similar things happened there before Hitler came to power. They had just a complete moral collapse in their culture. There are a lot of contemporary examples. And the second question was about the Jews as a race. Well, of course, I don't think that, because it's that's Hitlerian terms. But I have heard people talk about it in that way, and in Europe and also in the United States. But sometimes I think it's just not knowing. They don't really know, or they don't know the history, so they're not really certain of what they're saying. I do think it could be described as a culture, perhaps, but a race, no.
Two questions.
Okay.
What was considered the grounds for judging someone as being Jewish? Was it gossip from a neighbor? Did they do research in public records, religious documents? And the other question is, how many generations back did they typically research to determine the level of your Aryan purity?
Those are good questions, and I don't have all the answers to those. I do know that it was really random as far as being deported. Because there were some people in the book, like their mother might have been, their mother was Jewish, but they might not have been deported, right? They might have survived because they were married to an Aryan. But sometimes it depended on where they lived. Because if the local Gauleiter, if the local Nazi leaders were vicious, then the chances were very high that you would be deported, even though you were married to an Aryan. Okay, so there was a lot of randomness, especially with the mixed, because Hitler didn't know what to do with them as far as the mixture. Okay, he was kept stalling. He and Goebbels, the propaganda minister, weren't really certain. First, they wanted to sterilize them. And then they were going to deport them. So eventually, the Mischlinge were the next wave of deportees. So they would have been deported next. That was the solution. As far as, defining, I mean, there is a whole level of definitions of where you belonged, right? There was the Jews, then the first degree and second degree Mischlinge. Then you could be a Geltungsjuden, which meant you were counted as a Jew. That's how it's translated. That if you were had converted upon marriage, or you declared yourself a Jew, you were treated as a Jew and deported. Okay, so those were the basic categories that I'm giving you: the first and second degree, then Mischlinge, the half-breed. So they were well defined. Does that answer your question in part? Okay. I know I didn't talk much about the actual writing process, so if anybody has an interest in that, there's so many pieces to this book that we could be here for a while.
When you started, you said that a lot of these people were afraid still in trusting you and talking to you, and I wondered what they are afraid of or who they're afraid of now, and have any of them considered leaving the country?
Yes. There's still, I think there's a part of when you've been oppressed or you've been persecuted or gone through such pain that you sort of repress that part of your memory, right? And eventually it starts to come out again. And I've seen this in my own family. Everything was secret because at that time that's what you did, and especially in Germany, and a lot of the people will say this, that our family just didn't talk about it. You don't talk about those things. It remains a secret, okay? So I think that they'd been living with this fear the whole time that, well, if I reveal who I was at that time, then I'm going to get a backlash or I'll be ostracized again. So their goal was to be included in the community, into the German community again. They didn't want to be seen as half anything. So most of them will say, I didn't talk about it with people. I didn't tell them I was... And some of them defined themselves that way. They couldn't even kind of shake that definition that they'd lived with for 12 years. So they'd even address themselves as a half-breed to me or a half-Jew because that's what they had been defined as. But they would say, I didn't tell employers or I didn't tell my friends, or some of them did have friends still from that time, but it seemed very shaky. It wasn't like it had been. It was very uncomfortable for them. So they didn't want to be exposed again and put in the spotlight. One woman actually was afraid that when I came back to the United States, she didn't want her picture taken because she said, I don't want the right wing coming after me. I don't want people in the United States who are in the, these rightist extremists coming after me. I mean, that's how far, how the thought process went. A lot of fear. And I forget you asked me another part of that, and to answer the other part of the question. Yes, actually, one of the women in the book, Ursula Ramp, said that she felt most comfortable in Israel, England, or America. But I think, and what's fascinating to me is that it's language. They always come back to language. That, you know, the German language means so much to them, and they connect that way. And because they don't have another language, that they feel lost. And Ursula Bosselmann, the theologian I mentioned earlier, she would talk about how she'd go visit people who had emigrated to England, who were German, who got away, and in their old age they were speaking German. They couldn't even speak English anymore. They had just reverted completely to their mother language. And she said you're never 100% yourself in another country. So I found that really fascinating, because a lot of people do ask, well, why don't they just leave? Well, it's so complicated, and they have their roots, and it's difficult to leave. It's a huge risk to emigrate, and that's why a lot of people did, and they thought, well, it's going to pass over, it's going to end. And my grandfather had an first and second Iron Cross. He served in World War I as a doctor, and of course he was 50 years old when this was going on. He's 15 years older than my grandmother, and he wouldn't listen to anybody. He said, oh, no, I served in World War I, and a lot of people said that. They just couldn't even fathom, why do I have to leave? But when he started helping people himself to get out of the country, he worked in the prison as a doctor, and he started to see this. Then he would have he was supposedly on a Gestapo hit list to be killed, so he would have had to get out. So he knew, he was helping people to escape. Yeah.
I came because I've always been interested in survivors and how people do that under terrible circumstances, and I tried to talk a friend into coming who I think should have been interested in this subject, and his reaction was, well, I think it's time to move on. And
yeah.
I thought that was appalling, but I'd like to get your take on this issue.
Yeah, I've heard that before, too. I got that a lot in Germany as well, because people didn't want it dug up again. And I think that was why my father had that strong reaction about Germans. I don't have that feeling, because I was there and I saw the younger generation. A lot of the young students went with me and helped me with the project. And I was amazed by how much they were interested and how much they were concerned about this time period. They wanted to make sure that something like that didn't happen again. And most people feel that it's better to tell the stories, to get it out, and that so many people from this time are dead or dying, and especially right now, it's getting crucial that the stories are told. And I think in some ways that's why these women, I think they felt that. Even though they've been quiet, some of them had talked. Not all of them had been silenced. The first woman in my book is actually a spokesperson for the Michelin. She goes around and speaks to schools. She had a phobia for 30 years and couldn't go out of her house. But she wrote her first book, and it helped her to get better. So actually, writing and speaking helped her to survive and to go on with her life. But I do understand that other side of, enough already. I did hear that in Germany, too, about this time. But again, my book isn't just about the Holocaust, which I think some people feel like, oh, it's another, Holocaust book, or what we're going to hear these. But this has a little bit of, and nothing disparaging about that. It just has a different slant. Okay? I hope that helps.
How did the German community respond to the Mischlinge after the fall of the Third Reich, and did any elements of persecution still persist?
A lot of the people that I talked to felt like all of a sudden the war was over and they were German again. And they were just supposed to go right back into their normal life, but it didn't happen. They were, when I was talking to them all these years later, they were still recalling incidents and things that had happened to them after the war, where, yes, it still would come up that, somebody that might have known them at the time, and they'd hear disparaging remarks. Well, it's because you're a Jew, or, they still were struggling with it. And some of the women felt like the Jewish community they couldn't really go to them because they didn't fit, and yet some of them didn't really feel Christian, so they didn't know where to turn to talk about it. So it was often difficult. But certainly they were able to assimilate back into their culture a lot easier. And some of them did fine, and they're doing fine there. But I don't think it's easy when you've lived to live with your oppressors, because that's basically what they're doing. I'm not saying all of the Germans were Nazis. That's not the issue, but they feel that way. They don't know if they can trust, was this person my age? What did they do during that time? Where were they? So they always have that question in the back of their mind.
Today, are they really still prejudiced against the Jews, or did you notice that?
In Germany?
Yeah.
No, I think they had, as some of you may know if you're keeping up with international news, they had a lot of trouble with the Turks for a while. I mean, it's gotten better, but when I was there, it was really an issue with the Turkish people. So it is as if it had shifted. Now, I've heard from people recently, friends of mine in Germany, that there's kind of a resurgence of anti-Semitism there for various reasons. It's been reported in the papers. So I didn't get that feeling when I was there. I just got the feeling that people were uncomfortable around me as if a ghost came to town. and not all, but I'd say the older generation again. And a lot of denial, a lot of we don't want to talk about it, or I don't remember what happened, or I wasn't there, or it wasn't reported and we didn't know what was going on. That's what I heard a lot of, to be honest. Yeah.
Since most of the Mischlinge did not consider themselves Jewish, how did the persecution of them influence their attitudes toward the Jews, if at all?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's very split between the stories. Some people actually embraced this Jewish side of their family, and they although they weren't religiously Jewish, they really investigated that part of their family and that history and that background, and they feel a kinship, I would say. And just a few of the people were actually Christian in the book. Declared themselves that they were Christian, and some were just agnostic or said they were agnostic because they didn't really believe in anything anymore, after what they'd been through. But that's an interesting question because, again, what happened was you had a family where you could have a Jewish side of the family, right, where they're struggling, trying to survive. A lot of them were transported and killed, fighting for their lives. And then the other side is pro-Hitler, pro-Nazi. So here you have this child between these two extremes, and you see that split in their stories, because one woman would talk about going to visit her Jewish grandmother, and she's wearing a star, and she's walking through town with her, which she wasn't allowed to do. And then she'd go over and visit an uncle who was spouting, Nazi garbage as they walked in, and the child is totally confused. You have these two sides, which hasn't really been looked at before. It's very confusing. So I can see why a lot of these people did embrace that side of their life, of their family, even though, remember, they didn't even know usually about the Jewish side of their family. Oftentimes they were sat down in 1935, the Nuremberg laws were passed, the mother would come in and the children would sit down with them and they'd say, oh, by the way, I'm Jewish, or I have a Jewish bloodline. And as Ursula Bosselman said, the door to the world slammed shut. So that was it. She knew what that meant. She was one of the older ones. She was 18. So when her mother told her that, she knew that was, she couldn't see her friends anymore, that, that was it. The laws were all against her. Okay, one more question, they tell me. Yeah. It's hot up here.
First of all, I'd like to commend you for doing this project, especially within the first person. It's so hard to fathom what these people went through. And also, my question is, did the authorities in Germany give you a hard time, or did they willingly let you look through documents, etc.?
You guys are asking great questions, and these are tough ones too. It's like, do I tell them or do I not? I didn't really have any trouble per se, just there were a lot of roadblocks put in my way at times. For the most part, the archives, the director of the archives was very open and helpful. But as some of you may know, if you're researching in Germany or in Europe, at times it can be a lot more difficult to get documents. In the United States, it's a lot easier to go see things and to have, the librarians help you or the archivists help you. But there's a lot of procedure. I had to actually have a letter of introduction by the director of the history department at the University of Hamburg just to get in the door. And then it took a while to find the immigration file documents of my family. Those didn't appear very quickly. And apparently, we tried to get them before, and they'd been lost. So when I got there, they had appeared again, and I did get a chance to look through them and get them copied. But for the most part, there was a lot of help. I saw a lot of competition, though, between historians there, and I think it's because it's so difficult to get through the university system and get a university job there. So there was a lot of withholding of information. But overall, I found that, again, there was great help from the students because they knew I was doing this project. I was there as a researcher, and they wanted to come along, and it was a godsend for me because I would have a break. Because you're doing, 4 to 8 hours, 90 minutes, of taping, and they would offer a break, where I could go away for a while and they could chat, or they could redirect the conversation, because I did go with questions in my mind in a questionnaire that I wanted to at least cover certain questions, and if they got too far off, then somebody else could direct them back. But we had some great times, too, with the women. One woman, I always tell this story that she wanted to, she kept offering us sherry and brandy and wanted us to drink with her, and she just wanted to have a brandy so that she could talk. And we finally figured that out, because for an hour she wasn't really saying anything, but would you want a drink? You want a drink? And finally we said, you go ahead, and then it was, the doors open. But they were all very, very hospitable. I mean, had food and cakes, and really, I think we're ready to talk about it. And again, not everyone, was like that, had been secret. Some of them had already been talking, but had not been taped or had wanted their story to be published. So, one more question? Okay.
Yes, Cynthia, hi.
This wonderful woman took me through the museum today in Dayton, and it was a great experience. I told Fred when I left, I said, oh boy, what a day, what a way to start it. It was so emotional to see it. So, but thank you.
She's speaking about the Air Force Museum and the Holocaust exhibit
right.
there, and we're pleased that you came.
She took me this morning.
Has this caused you to formulate any feeling about your own heritage more so? And your father obviously has deep feelings about his commitment to making the world a better place and not allowing it to happen again. Has this also come upon you in the same way or in a different way?
Another tough question. I feel really grateful that I had the opportunity to record these stories. I think that it was meant to be, because I thought I had the idea when I was there that I would like to talk to living people, and then the doors opened, and I thought, at each step of the way, it seemed to be that it was meant for me to record them and to write it and put this story together. And a lot of people have come out, they've written me, sent emails to the website and told me their stories. So there's a lot more stories out there. And it's not just from this time period. Again, I'm getting them from, even from people who had trouble, in the United States, from different, races, ethnicities, and how they can relate to this issue. And it's really interesting for me to hear that. And as far as my own, of course, that's another book. The process, what I went through myself going back, because when you're young and then you hear these stories as you get older, again, I didn't hear really anything until I was a teenager and even older. It was kind of secret. I knew my family came somewhere else, but I wasn't really sure what happened. So when you arrive, when I got to Hamburg, and there was a photograph or a portrait of my great-grandfather hanging on the wall in this state house. He was a senator in Hamburg. And then there was a street named after him, his school, and all of a sudden, it's like all these pieces fall together, and you thought, I didn't know any of this, and it's right there in front of you, so it means a lot. There's a real connection, and I can see why people trace their, trace their lineage and try to find their roots. It's understandable. See, I have another question, or are they pointing at me? Well, thank you for coming, and I want to thank Books and Company and St. Martin's Press and my family, my father and mother for being here, and my brother for coming tonight. And if anyone else, if you're interested, you can get on the website at dividedlives.com, and there's excerpts and more information, because there's a lot more to be said. So thank you.
Cynthia Crane is author of Divided Lives, The Untold Stories of Jewish Christian Women in Nazi Germany. It's published by St. Martin's Press. For more information, you can visit their website at stmartinspress.com.